Make sure did I turn this back on? I don't know. I can't tell. It's on. All right. So I've been studying the Navy and Marine Corps in North Carolina really since I was the Mary Holloway seasonal interpreter at Fort Fisher in 1998. That was my first exposure to the naval side of the war, really. And my first full-time job with Historic Sites was as the assistant site manager at CSS Noose. And so from there, I just kind of dove into the naval aspect of the war. And, I find out more and more that so many people don't even now know that the Confederacy even had a Marine Corps. Now, granted, as we're going to see, it was extremely small, but there was a Confederate Marine Corps. There certainly was a Confederate Navy. But when we're talking about the Marine Corps, neither the U.S. or the Confederate Marine Corps played a huge role in North Carolina until very late in the war. The role of the Confederate Marine Corps was somewhat varied. The Union, the U.S. Marine Corps pretty much was what you might expect from the U.S. Marine Corps. Go to the next slide. So we got to cover some important ground here, sort of some foundational stuff. Confederate Navy Department created February 20th of 61. 5 days later, you get the appointment of Stephen Mallory as Secretary of the Navy. Stephen Mallory is an excellent choice for that job. Prior to the war, he had been a United States Senator from Florida, and he was the chair of the Senate Naval Affairs Committee. He was very, very keenly interested in naval affairs, shipbuilding technology, naval ordnance. I mean, he was a generally curious person and was very interested in naval matters in general. So he was a good choice for this job. March 11th, you have the organization of the various bureaus and departments within the Navy Department. You see here ordnance and hydrography, orders and details, medicine and surgery, all these things. And there is a provision for a commandant of the Confederate Marine Corps, but the Marine Corps was not actually created until 5 days later. The Confederate Marine Corps is authorized for basically a regimental-sized unit, 1,000 men. They never achieved that goal throughout the war. It's doubtful there were more than 600 or 700 at any given point in time during the war. They never hit that 1,000 mark. I mean, maybe they had 1,000 total, but never at the same time. Next. Now here's no, go back. Here's some other important numbers to think about. The United States Marine Corps prior to the war was much, much smaller, and it quickly grew, as did all the branches of the military. At the outbreak of the war, the United States Marine Corps had about 1,750 men, which is still larger than what the Confederate Marine Corps would ever have. But by the end of the war, the U.S. Marine Corps had grown to about 4,000. So a lot of growth. You also have a lot of Union Navy and Marine Corps officers who resign and go south to fight for their states, much like a lot of your Army officers and personnel did. Here you see 2,234 officers in the United States Navy and Marine Corps. 321 resign and go south to the Confederacy. And then you see here, by the end of the war, you have an estimated 5,000 officers and men in the Confederate Navy. Again, 600 or 700 or so in the Confederate Marine Corps. And there's your comparison. In the U.S. Navy, you're looking at 70,000 plus, and U.S. Marine Corps 4,000. So huge numerical difference there. And then you see the number of ships. 670 ships. Now, granted, the U.S. Navy didn't have 670 ships when the war started. That was a tremendous buildup. Tremendous buildup. And the fact that the Confederacy was able to get 130 ships in the water during the course of the war is a major accomplishment, given their drawbacks and the difficulties that they faced. Next slide. Let's talk about uniforms and equipment a little bit. When you look at the United States Marine Corps uniform, it hasn't changed a whole lot over the years. It bears a strong resemblance to the modern dress blues, okay? Basic uniform for the U.S. Marine Corps. You see here in the image on the left, this is obviously an artist's drawing, but this is your basic Marine Corps uniform. The one on the left there, and these two, middle and right, are your enlisted men. The one on the left is your officer. You're looking at a navy blue frock coat with red piping. NCO chevrons were the familiar scarlet and gold that the U.S. Marine Corps still uses today. You had a navy blue kepi with a USMC emblem on the front. Sky kersey blue trousers similar to the Union Army. In the summertime, they were authorized to wear the white trousers. And again, that's on ship, that's captain's choice. Just as the Navy had white summer uniforms that they could wear in hot weather and tropical climates and such, the Marines were authorized for the white trousers. What made the U.S. Marine Corps a little bit more distinct was their leather accoutrements. You see here the white cross belts and the white waist belt. That really made them stand out. And all of the plates on that leather gear, the chest plate, the belt plate, they're all plain. There's no adornment, no emblems. It's just a plain brass plate. Otherwise, their gear was pretty much the same as the Army. Same haversacks, same cartridge boxes and canteens and weapons and everything. What you see here in the picture on the right, the NCO who's instructing the Marine there, you see kind of an odd garment he's wearing on top. This is something that you see earlier in the war, and I think it kind of gets phased out. It's kind of an unusual garment that was very specific to the Marine Corps, and there's no real official name for it. I've seen it referred to as a pullover sack. Basically, the pattern is cut the same as the U.S. Army sack coat, but it's only split halfway down the front instead of the whole way. So it's got the buttons. It's a pullover rather than a jacket. It's got a 4-button placket. It was pulled over the head like an overshirt. But again, later in the war, those were phased out. That was sort of an oddity that kind of hung around early in the war, and then they eventually got rid of that. Officers' dress uniforms were much more elaborate, more adornment, more, finery and things like that. Early in the war, a lot of your Marines were still carrying the older 69 caliber 1842 Springfields, smoothbore muskets. Some of them had upgraded to the model 1855 Springfield rifle, which was, the 58 caliber rifle that most of us are familiar with from the war. By the middle of the war, the Marine Corps had completely shifted over to the model 1861 Springfield. But early on, you still see a lot of the smoothbore muskets and in the earlier 1855 model rifles. The Marine Corps was sort of in the middle of that change when the war started. And as the war progressed, they completed that. Next slide. So here's more artists' depictions of U.S. Marines in action. You can see the various uniforms, the white trousers in the picture on the left, and the more standard blue trousers in the picture on the right. Just, again, more artist depictions of the uniforms. Next slide. And here's some period images. You can see in the image on the right, they're wearing their dress uniforms, which included the leather shako. They would not wear those in anything other than a dress kind of a situation. And here you see Marines manning a gun on board a ship, wearing all their leathers and everything, even in that instance. So it gives you some idea. And you see in this picture on the right, you see the officer on the left end. He's got the shoulder scales and some of the more fancier stuff. Next. And just another, I think this was probably taken in Washington, D.C. All right, next. And here's some reenactors. Some of the best U.S. Marine Corps reenactors in the country are in Baltimore, ship's company on the Constellation. And here's a couple of pictures of them, one in their dress uniforms, and then one, of course, on shipboard doing a living history program. Those guys probably are in terms of authenticity, the best U.S. Marine Corps unit in the country. They have their stuff together. And here again, and there's my group on the right portraying U.S. Navy and Marines over at Fort Anderson a couple of years ago. We've got a couple of guys in our group that do Marine as well. In fact, the fellow on the end with corporal stripes is a retired Marine. So, he hung up the modern uniform and started wearing that. Next. So here in North Carolina, the first time we see U.S. Marines appear is during the August 1861 Hatteras expedition. If you're familiar with this expedition, the Union sends a joint force expedition to Cape Hatteras to close down Hatteras Inlet, basically to put an end to Confederate privateering in the Albemarle Sound. The Confederates were running small privateers out the Albemarle Sound and out Hatteras Inlet, attacking coastal shipping and things like that. Union government decided they wanted to put a stop to that, so they send Benjamin Butler down here with an expedition in August of '61. He and the naval officer Silas Stringham come to Hatteras Inlet. They capture both of the forts, Hatteras and Clark, and shut down Hatteras Inlet. This eventually is then a precursor to the Burnside expedition the following spring. You do have Marines who are landed during the Hatteras expedition, U.S. Marines from the ships that are involved. But once the Hatteras expedition is over, that's it. We really don't see any U.S. Marines in North Carolina after that until late in the war. There are very few, if any, Marines involved in the Burnside expedition in the spring of '62. And aside from the Marines that are out here on the blockading vessels off the coast, there's really not a whole lot of U.S. Marine Corps presence in North Carolina until the very end when we get to Fort Fisher. Next. So what about the Confederate Marines? What did they look like? We've talked about how they were small in number, this, that, and the other. The Confederate Marine Corps is very conspicuously absent from North Carolina for most of the war. The early companies that were recruited were scattered all around the Gulf Coast, New Orleans, Mobile, Pensacola, and then up around Charleston and Savannah. There were Confederate Marines in Richmond, and the headquarters for the Confederate Marine Corps was established at Drury's Bluff. So here in North Carolina, we don't see a lot of Confederate Marines. Uniform regulations for the Confederate Marine Corps are really hard to pin down. Early in the war, they were wearing all kinds of stuff, as evidenced in this picture on the left. They were wearing pieces of Army uniforms. Some of them were wearing blue Navy uniforms that have been captured in U.S. government warehouses at places like New Orleans and Pensacola and places like that where they had storehouses of uniforms. You had Confederate Marines wearing blue Navy uniforms until they could get something different. It's all over the place early in the war. If you go by what the regulations state for the Confederate Marine Corps, a Confederate Marine would look a lot like this fella here on the right. The regulations consist of navy blue trousers, a navy blue kepi, with a gray frock coat. And here's think about this. They kept the frock coat just like the U.S. Marine Corps did. When the armies were going to sack coats and shell jackets and shorter coats, both the U.S. Marine Corps and the Confederate Marine Corps kept the longer frock coat. I don't know if that was just a Marine thing or what, but even the Confederate Marines kept that gray frock coat. Chevrons would have been black as far as we can tell. I see reenactors with scarlet and gold chevrons on their gray coats, and it drives me crazy because they wouldn't have used U.S. Marine Corps insignia on their coat. Just like with the U.S. Marine Corps, the Confederate Marine Corps authorized white cotton trousers in the summertime. So some traditions, don't really die. Given the Confederate supply system, it's really, really difficult to say how much they really attained that standard. There's a difference between what you see in the regulations and what they were actually wearing. They were not supplied nearly so well as the Army. They didn't have the capacity that the Army did. And so it's hard to say if they really all ever looked the same at any given point. Go to the next slide. Here's a couple of pictures, as terrible as they are, of Confederate Marines. Of course, you have the officer over here on the right. That looks a whole lot like an Army officer coat. And a lot of your Confederate Marine Corps officers did wear Army officer coats because that's what they could get. And these other pictures, it's really hard to tell. The one reason I like this picture on the left is looking at that belt. That's British leather gear. That's a British belt, British ball bag, everything. So we know that at least some of them had the British leather gear. You know, but it's hard to say based on these pictures what they're really wearing. You know, especially the guy in the middle. We just know he's a Marine. Next. Here's a Marine group. A lot of these guys are out of Virginia. You see here on the left the company being drilled by the sergeant, and then their officer over here on the right. And you see again, just like with the U.S. Marine Corps, Confederate Marine Corps, the officers' uniforms are a little bit nicer. They're going with more of a cadet gray for the coat as opposed to just a plain gray. They've got fancier, you know, shoulder insignia, all that kind of stuff. But this is sort of a basic summer look for the Marine Corps. And you even have a guy there right in the middle that's wearing a short coat, not the frock coat. Totally possible, depending on what time of war it was. Just like with their uniforms, their weapons and equipment were a hodgepodge. I mean, if you look at any of the evidence that we have from the Confederate Marine Corps, again, you find them using smoothbore muskets, 1842 variants, things like that, Palmetto Armory muskets, stuff like that, whatever was in the Southern arsenals. I'm sure some of them probably had Mississippi rifles because there were plenty of them in the Southern arsenals. Over the course of the war, they acquired better arms when they could. They preferred the shorter Enfield rifles, model 1857 rifle, what a lot of reenactors today call the two-bander. That was their preference. That's what they would have liked to have had. They probably had some of those. They probably had some of the standard Enfield rifle muskets. We know a lot of them were armed with 1854 Austrian Lorenz rifles. There's a lot of those that show up, especially here in North Carolina. So again, with the Confederate Marine Corps, it's just whatever they can get. It's sort of a hodgepodge of stuff. So let's talk about Marines in North Carolina. Confederate Marines do not appear in North Carolina until 1864. Like I said, we don't see Confederate Marines here until very late in the war. But when they come here, they make an impact. They make a big impact. There was a contingent of Marines led by this gentleman, Captain Thomas Wilson, that were in North Carolina for the Underwriter Expedition in February of 1864. Underwriter Expedition brings in Navy and Marine Corps personnel from all over the South. They come in here to Wilmington. They go by train to Kinston. Then they get on small boats and launches, go down the Neuse River, capture and destroy the USS Underwriter, go back to Kinston, disband, and most of them go back to wherever they came from. A few of the officers were left here in North Carolina and became the officer corps for the CSS Neuse. So this is a highly exciting operation. I mean, I do a whole presentation on the Underwriter Expedition. Very exciting operation, very daring operation led by John Taylor Wood. But Captain Thomas Wilson is the commander of the Marines on that expedition. And we know that some of those Marines, at least some of them, had the 1854 Austrian Lorenz rifles. We know that. Some of them probably had Enfields, but a lot of them were carrying the Austrian rifles. So Marines in this instance, Underwriter Expedition, basically served as sharpshooters. They were divided up on the boats with the sailors, and as they approached the Underwriter, they were used as sharpshooters to try to pick off guards and things like that and cover the sailors who were boarding the ship. Next. Just a month before that, in January of 1864, actually the first Confederate Marines that arrive in North Carolina here in Wilmington. They come here, they're transferred here to serve aboard the CSS North Carolina and CSS Raleigh. I wish I'd put this guy's name on this slide because now I can't remember it. But this is one of the first Marines that came here to Wilmington to help crew the ironclads. Of course, we know the story of the CSS Raleigh and CSS North Carolina. The Marines on the Raleigh got to have a little bit of fun before their ship ran aground and sank, escorting those blockade runners out that night and skirmishing with the Union blockading fleet. The ones that were on the CSS North Carolina probably didn't have such a good experience. You know, that ship being moored off of Southport as a floating battery and eventually, you know, sinking there in the river because of a worm-eaten hull. However, the fact that they were here in Wilmington with the ironclads led to a future assignment. Well, there's the Raleigh escorting the blockade runners out and firing on Union ships. Next. Once the ironclads were gone, those Marines were transferred. They were shifted to duty aboard two commerce raiders, the Tallahassee and the Chickamauga. The Tallahassee / Olustee changed names. That ship captured 37 prizes in 2 cruises. Those Marines got to have a lot of fun. The Chickamauga made 8 captures. So those Marines that were sent here to help man the ironclads end up on the cruisers out in the ocean capturing prizes, which I'm sure was very preferable to them rather than sitting on an ironclad here in the harbor waiting for something to happen. So these are our first Marines in North Carolina, Confederate Marines in North Carolina, is January and February of 1864. Very, very late in the war. And even though we had naval presence here, naval presence in Wilmington, Kinston, for a short while Plymouth, no Marines. No Marines to speak of, all sailors. Next slide. But when we get to the end, when we get to Fort Fisher, this is where the Confederate and U.S. Marines converge. Confederate Marines manned artillery pieces at Fort Fisher and Battery Buchanan during both engagements. The Marines that were already here had their numbers augmented when the Savannah Squadron came here after the fall of Savannah in December of '64. Confederate Marines manned the guns of the Brook Battery, and I mentioned Battery Buchanan already. So now you have, for the first time, only time during the war, really a large presence of Confederate Marines here in North Carolina, and they're here. They're here at Fort Fisher. If you come to Fort Fisher's program next weekend, we will have some Navy and Marine Corps reenactors there. Funny thing, a lot of Navy reenactors making noise on Facebook about, oh, I want to come to Fort Fisher, I want to come to Fort Fisher. So I said, great, I'm going to organize all these guys and get them here. I thought we were going to have 25 or 30, sailors and Marines, nice group. I'll probably have about a dozen. All those guys that were itching to come here all of a sudden aren't coming. I don't know what happened to them. The entire Savannah Squadron backed out on me. And I was like, guys, this is where you made your last stand. This is your last hurrah. No, yeah, we're not going to come. So, but we will have some both U.S. and Confederate sailors and Marines at Fort Fisher next weekend, next Saturday. And they will be able to tell you whatever you want to know about the Confederate Navy and Marine Corps. They're all good interpreters. They're all been doing this a long time. And they're coming from all over the country. I got some coming from as far away as Texas. So, that I'm appreciative of them. Next slide. So, January of 1865, the U.S. Marine Corps returned to North Carolina and made their biggest impact of the war on the state. As part of the naval landing party that was assembled for the assault on the fort, the Marines were to provide cover fire for the sailors as they rushed the bastion. 15% of the Marines in the party became casualties during the battle. The Navy suffered much higher losses than that. This is definitely not, and that picture on the right, it does not portray Fort Fisher. That's just a general picture. I needed an amphibious landing picture, and that one fit the bill. That's obviously not Fort Fisher. They wouldn't be wearing white pants in January. But you see Captain Lucian Dawson here on the left, who commanded those 400 Marines that came ashore. For the 150th anniversary at Fort Fisher, we had the U.S. Marine Corps Historical Company at Fort Fisher. They are Marines. They're active duty and retired Marines that portray the Marine Corps throughout all of history, and they do a terrific job. And they are the first ones to admit, yeah, Fort Fisher's not really the best look for us. We didn't do too good there. But you know what? Sunday morning, they were still out on the beach posing pictures and stuff. They were out there in the uniforms, taking up poses and all this kind of stuff, because it's that important to the Marine Corps even today. You know, they see Fort Fisher as one of their watershed moments. It's one of them, you know, one of the things that they say, you know, this is a big deal for us. Even though we didn't do so good, this is a big deal for us. And the Marine Corps still maintains that connection. Next. Now, researching the Confederate Marine Corps especially is pretty difficult. There's not a lot of records. It's, you know, U.S. Marine Corps is a little easier. Confederate Marine Corps is harder to pin down. But there's some good resources out there. And I like to end all my talks with this. If you want to know more, here's some resources that you can find that are helpful. The Osprey Publishing books are really good basic, you know, books on, and they publish on all time periods and all topics. And this one on American Civil War Marines does cover the U.S. and Confederate Marine Corps. And it's a good start. It's a good start. Information's pretty basic, but it's good. If you really want to know about the U.S. Marine Corps and the Civil War, here you go. A 4-book series written by David Sullivan. These have been out of print for years. If you can find all 4 of them, you're doing good. I'm lucky. I do have all 4 of these. Over the years, I just kept looking on eBay and different places and was able to collect all 4 of them. David Sullivan really is, I think, the foremost historian of the U.S. Marine Corps, particularly for the 18th and 19th century. And I mean, anybody who can write 4 volumes on the Marine Corps and the Civil War, he knows his stuff. He lives in Massachusetts. He's, I want to say, in his mid-80s. He continued doing reenacting until he was, I think he finally quit reenacting when he turned 80. We had him down here at Fort Fisher a few years ago, and the guys in his group referred to him as the old sage because he would sit at the campfire and talk to visitors all day long. And it's all up here. I mean, the guy is tremendous. He's also the editor for the journal Military Collector and Historian, which is published by the Company of Military Historians. He still edits that journal to this day, and he does a terrific job, and he's got at least 1 article in every issue. And he and I have traded research over the years. He's sent me a lot of stuff that I hadn't found on my own. And the last time we had him at Fort Fisher, Chris happened to be there giving a talk that day. And I found out that he and David Sullivan had never met. And I said, oh, we got to rectify this. You know, David says, oh, I've never met Chris Fonville. And I said, all right, we got to get that straightened out. So Chris got to meet David Sullivan, and y'all talked for a good long while, didn't you?
We corresponded for years.
Yeah. He's the man is amazing. He really is. But if you want to know anything about the U.S. Marine Corps and the Civil War, try to find these books. He also, years ago, what's the publication that the Lower Cape Fear Historical Society puts out? Is it the Bulletin? Is that what it's called? Their newsletter thing? Bulletin. So in the late 80s, early 90s, David Sullivan wrote a 2-part series on the Confederate Marines in North Carolina that was published in the Bulletin. If you can find that, I've got copies of it at the office. So that's another thing local. If you can get your hands on a copy at the library or somewhere, and that's probably, I mean, that's my source for a lot of my information on the Confederate Marines in North Carolina. Next one. Here's a couple other good ones on the, If you want to know about uniforms, there you go. That's it. I mean, that's the Bible of U.S. Marine Corps uniforms. The regulations of 1859, which is what they were using throughout the war. Great book if you really want to know about uniforms and equipment. And then Lincoln's Navy, there's a chapter in there on the U.S. Marines that's good basic information. But then certainly it's about it's about more about the Navy than the Marine Corps, but there's a chapter on the Marine Corps in there. And Ralph Donnelly wrote a book on the Confederate States Marine Corps. There again, that's been out of print for at least 20 years probably. But, you know, you can pick them up on eBay or wherever. And then the companion to Lincoln's Navy, the Confederate Navy, Ships Organization, there is a really good chapter in there on the Confederate Marine Corps, written, of course, by David Sullivan. You know, these are just some sources. If you want to learn more, these are the places I would start. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. So, any questions? I think it was just tradition. If you have a Navy, you got to have a Marine Corps, right? Although the Confederate Marine Corps didn't function like the U.S. Marine Corps did. The U.S. Marine Corps served the traditional function of providing security on board ship. Confederate Marines really didn't do that. I mean, they did to an extent. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you find, like, Confederate Marines, you find them on ship, but you also find them at stations. You know, there was a bunch with the Savannah Squadron on station duty. So it's a little bit different, but I think I think it was just holding to tradition. If you have a Navy, you have to have a Marine Corps. Another thing about holding to tradition, now that I brought it up, the Confederate Navy had a really, really hard time going to a gray uniform. So many of those guys had been in the U.S. Navy before the war. And I used to think it was just one of those stories that you hear, but there was actually a naval officer when the Confederate Navy adopted the gray uniform. It said, "Who ever heard of a gray sailor?" That was just foreign to them, that they would wear anything other than a blue uniform. So it's just those traditions that carry on. And I suspect that's why the Confederacy said, hey, if we're going to have a Navy, we might as well have a Marine Corps to go with it. I don't know that there was any other more logical thought process that went into that.
We also saw pictures of, I assume, Confederate Marine that had a white cover on.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that was the U.S. Marine had a white cover on his kepi. That's another tropical / summertime uniform edition. It was a white cover that went over the blue kepi. But see, this is my problem with artist renditions. Those were really rare. I don't know that I've ever seen a photograph with a Marine with one of those white covers on his kepi. Sure, if it's in the regulations, but do they actually wear them? That's, we find over and over again when you look at some of the photographs, they're deviating from the regulations occasionally. They're doing some things a little bit different. But and the Marine Corps started to really change things towards the end of the war. Good example. The white leathers, the white cross belts, waist belt and all that looks really good in like a dress situation. But yeah, out on the battlefield, that stands out really, really bad. So the Marines started to adapt. When they attacked Fort Sumter at night, the Marines blackened all their leather gear. They're like, we're making a nighttime attack. These white belts are going to stand out. We're wearing blue uniforms and these white belts. No, this isn't good. All the Marines before that attack, they blackened all their leather gear. So they do adapt over the course of the war as necessary. Confederate Marines, God, towards the end of the war, I doubt you could have even recognized the Confederate Marine at the end of the war. because their supply system was pretty much non-existent. And one of the examples I use for that, the Marines that were still in Richmond when Richmond was evacuated, they evacuate Richmond and they clean out the storehouses. They're issuing out uniforms that are still in the storehouses in Richmond. I would not be the least bit surprised. In fact, I'd almost guarantee every Confederate Marine that ends up at Sailor's Creek was probably wearing a Richmond Depot jacket, because they were just issuing out new jackets as they were getting out of town. And I guarantee you those Marines had them. They probably didn't even look like Marines anymore. So it, depending on time of war and situation, I think you're going to see a lot of variation, especially on the Confederate side.
Was there a particular base where the Confederate Marines trained?
A lot of them trained at Drury's Bluff, and that's just because that's where headquarters was on the James River. But when these first companies were started, they were assigned to their posts. There was no like central training. So they probably trained on post once they got there. But the bulk of them that were attached to headquarters at Drury's Bluff, they were training there all the time. I've researched one of the officers that was on the CSS News, and before he came to North Carolina, he was at Drury's Bluff for a good long stretch of the war. And it's interesting to read his letters and things from his time that he was there, because it's very typical military stuff that you wouldn't even think about. He'd say, "Oh, I went to Richmond today to sit on a court-martial. I went to Richmond today to sit on an examining board." It was just normal, everyday administrative stuff that he was doing. So those Marines at Drury's Bluff were drilling on the guns. They were probably drilling on their rifles. It was probably the same as what you would find in any Army organization that was in camp. Just daily drill, daily activity. And then every once in a while, oh yeah, because he's an officer, he's going to Richmond for all these weird, things, these one-off things. But I think most of their training took place on post wherever they got sent to when they first got in. There's no centralized anything.
So it's amazing about the uniforms, and what my question is somebody had to design them, and then where were they made? I can understand how the women might have gotten involved in, some kind of design process, but they had to make them.
With so few records from the Confederate Marine Corps, it's hard to say where those were made. Their supply system really was much harder to track than the Army's. I really don't have an answer for that one. I don't know.
Right, I mean, it is.
Oh, well, I mean, the U.S. government certainly had their system all worked out for uniform manufacture. They had, whoever was making their various companies that were making their uniforms. With the Confederacy, it's not like in North Carolina where you have the North Carolina Depot cranking out coats and trousers and stuff. The Marine Corps didn't have anything like that. So that's why I say, like, early in the war, they're taking whatever they can find out of old, U.S. storehouses and things like that. And then as the war progresses, you see the Confederate Navy is making purchases for cloth. But then where that's getting turned into uniforms is hard to trace.
Yeah, Pat, you mentioned Drury's Bluff, the first U.S. Marine to be awarded the Medal of Honor was a corporal named Mackey, who was on the USS Galena. They were going up the James River with a squadron to take on Drury's Bluff.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Mackey, the first Marine Medal of Honor winner, U.S. Marine, and the guys that were shooting at him were almost assuredly Confederate Marines or sailors, because they were all manning those guns on the bluff. That's Chris.
And if you speak to Chris Meekins, really the North Carolina Navy and Marines.
Yeah. So my colleague Chris Meekins is currently the editor of the North Carolina Troops roster series. And the volume that was just released last year was the volume that covers the Confederate Navy and Marine Corps. So it is a roster of every North Carolinian who served in the Confederate Navy and Marine Corps, plus the Charlotte Naval Yard and other Navy facilities. And so if you want to know who from North Carolina served in the Confederate Navy and Marine Corps, they're all in there. And there's a good narrative at the beginning of the book that sort of gives a history of the Confederate Navy and Marine Corps and how they operated in North Carolina, mainly the Navy, because like I said, the Marines didn't really get here till so late in the war. There were very, very few North Carolinians in the Confederate Marine Corps. In fact, I've looked at a list of every officer in the Confederate Marine Corps, and only one was from North Carolina, and he was lieutenant. So, and North Carolinians in the Confederate Marine Corps are really few and far between. Plenty of sailors, as Chris's book shows. I mean, I can't remember how many names are in that book, but it's a thick volume. And I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with the North Carolina Troop Roster Series. The Confederate Navy Marine Corps volume that just came out was number 22, and it was the last Confederate volume. They are now starting to work on volumes for Union troops from North Carolina, and they're starting with Union Navy and Marine Corps, I believe. And then they'll move on to North Carolina Union Volunteers and North Carolina colored troops. So, yeah, I think they're finished with the Confederate series. I think that Navy and Marine volume was the last one.
So were there any U.S. Marines in the second attack on Fort Fisher?
Oh yes, yeah. They were not on shore during the first attack, but second attack. That's when you had those 400 Marines come ashore and lost the 61 casualties in that. So it is the second battle of Fort Fisher where the U.S. Marines are right up there front and center.
So they weren't in the first.
They were on ship. I don't know. I don't believe there were any U.S. Marines landed during the first attack. It was all Army personnel that were landed and then never assaulted the fort.
The 400 Marine unit that landed Fort Fisher, were they Marines off of various?
They were selected off the ships in the fleet. Yeah, they were selected from the ships in the fleet and put together as a unit. Yeah.
Did the Marines, U.S. Marines have any other significant landings in maybe in the Western Theater and you're aware of?
Western Theater.
Mississippi or?
The Marines are pretty scarce out that way. Most of the Marines you're going to find are going to be East Coast and Gulf Coast. I mean, I'm not very familiar with Western Theater, but I've not seen a lot of reference to Marines on the gunboats in the Mississippi. Not many.
In the first slide where it shows the U.S. troops with their uniforms, why are they laying entrenched there?
It was a French military manual that drawing came out of. Yeah. But that was, yeah, those were U.S. Marine uniforms, but it was a French military manual that image came from. Yeah. And I don't know if it was a French book about the Civil War or what, but it was a French manual of some kind. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, going to John Brown Road, but it was Marines that we used at Duppstadt, I believe.
Yes.
Why do they use Marines instead of
Marines were close by, Washington, D.C.
Headquarters.
Yeah, headquarters, 8th and 9, yeah. They were nearby. They could get there quickly. I don't know if there's any other logic behind that or not, but they could get those Marines there, pretty quickly. And the group I showed you on the Constellation in Baltimore, they also do an impression for Harper's Ferry. I think they're the only ones that are doing a Harper's Ferry impression. Yeah, led by Robert E. Lee. Yeah, sure. But yeah, those guys, their Harper's Ferry impression is every bit as impressive as their Civil War impression. They do a great job. Great job. I wish I could get them down here from Fort Fisher. Yeah.
You said those 400 U.S. Marines didn't perform very well at Fort Fisher.
Well, they were put in a difficult situation. You know, they're supposed to provide cover fire for the assaulting Navy. Well, you're assaulting the fort across open ground. The sailors are armed with pistols and cutlasses, and the Marines are trying to provide cover fire, and they don't have any cover themselves. It really wasn't, you know, a defining moment necessarily for the Marine Corps. I think the Marine Corps sort of uses it as a failure because they didn't breach the fort. Now, they created the diversion that allowed the fort to be breached, but they themselves got just pinned down in front of the fort and got stuck. So it's not exactly the shining example that the Marine Corps likes to put forward because they didn't win. They did, you know, they were put in a tough position there. Boats, small boats, launches.
So in other words, we're taking 400 people, we're moving from ships shore, okay, we're moving with boats of some size. So how many were there and how many Marines were on each ship?
That I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I'd have to look that one up. I mean, when you're talking about launches coming off of ships, yeah, I'd have to look that one up. I'm not sure. Chris, how many ships were in the Union fleet? 50?
There was 64 in the first attack, 58 in the second.
So you have 58 ships. Each ship is going to be carrying at least 4 boats. Yeah, I don't know how many would fit in each boat. That I'd have to look all that up.
These were volunteers of various classes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
About half, 27 ships in shore.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was, yeah, they were volunteers. They were not like, they asked who wants to go on shore and make this attack. Yeah.
I'd be interested in understanding, okay, we're going to put you on the little boats, and you're going to go ashore. Who's commanding that, and how are they organized, and what is their objective other than to provide support? Right? Those are kind of things that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
I have an excellent way for you to find out. There's no other book that the Wilmington can pay by. You see the current president of the organization. It's a brand new copy for $45. You're welcome to it. The model autograph.
How much are you paying her, Chris? How much are you paying her for hawking your books, man?
Andrew, you mentioned the commander of the Marine attack.
Yeah.
Shore was,
Lucian Dawson. Yeah, Captain Dawson.
He was tax supervisor.
He was what?
He was from Texas.
Yeah.
Andrew, the overall commander was General Randolph.
Yeah, oh, the overall commander of that landing force was Breeze, who was a naval officer, but the commander of the Marines was Captain Dawson. Yeah.
He was from the Mountain.
He was what?
He was from the Mountain.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you again.